The Game Boy line of consoles are one of the most popular handheld consoles ever made, and in this video we're going to go over 4 different types of them, starting with the original Game Boy and ending with the Game Boy SP. So this here is the original Game Boy, released in North America and Japan in 1989, but it wasn't released in the UK until 1990. It sold 118 million units worldwide, so it was very, very popular. In terms of its design, it is very 80s. It's just a big grey slab, very thick, with a small display and only 4 buttons, A, B, start and select, and a D-pad. Alright. The sides are really bare. You've got a contrast slider, a volume slider. You've got a link port, which allows you to play games with your friends in 2-player. And it's got a mono speaker on the front. Some games did support stereo, but you had to use the audio jack on the bottom with a pair of headphones to get that feature. The best thing about the Game Boy is the battery life, alright? It took 4 AA batteries, and that could get you 10 to 30 hours of gameplay, depending on what game you were playing. Now, that was incredible when you compared it to other consoles at the time, such as the Sega Game Gear, which took 6 AA batteries, and you were lucky to get 5 hours of battery life out of it. So that was phenomenal. The reason for this is because it had actually quite low specs, even for the time. It only has a 4 MHz processor with 8 kilobytes of RAM and 8 kilobytes of VRAM, alright? So that's what got you your playtime. The display was also very, very low spec, if you will. It was only just over 2 inches, which for the time wasn't too bad, but it only displayed green and grey, which means that there was no colour in it whatsoever, whereas the Game Gear had a full colour display, and that's also what drained the battery. Now, they did this purely to keep the price down. When this was released, it sold for $89 US, which in comparison is only about £70, which was incredibly affordable. In fact, it undercut its competition like the Atari Lynx, which was another colour display console at the time, by $100. That just meant that people, when they went out for Christmas, they bought one of these for their kids. The guy who ran the team who designed this was a man named Gameboy Colour, and he knew that this was underpowered. He knew he could have made a better machine, but he had the motto of lateral thinking with withered technology, which means you don't have to have the highest specs to make a really enjoyable gaming experience, and he was right. Even though this is so low powered, it's still a really, really fun console to play. And the most popular games on this were Pokemon, Red and Blue, which sold about 26 million, but the most popular was Tetris, and this sold over 30 million units, mainly because it was a pack-in title with the Game Boy when it originally came out. Nintendo tried to be very creative with the original Game Boy as well. They released some peripherals which are actually quite forward-thinking. One we have with us is the Game Boy camera. Now this is, I think, a 0.3 megapixel camera, and it plugs into your Game Boy, just like this, like any regular ROM card, but it acts as a digital camera. And it was in fact the first consumer digital camera ever made. And there's a game inside, so you load it up, you can take selfies with it, you can put stamps on it, you can put filters on it, so it's basically Snapchat for the 90s, and it's really, really inventive. Now, the only way you can get them off is by getting another peripheral, which we don't have, called the Game Boy printer. And then you can just print them off. They're very low resolution, you probably wouldn't hang them on a wall, but very, very inventive. There were a couple of other versions of the Game Boy that were released over time. You had the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Pocket was just a smaller version of the Game Boy, and the Game Boy Light had light on the display, which we wouldn't see again until the SP. We don't have them, so we won't go over them, and they're relatively rare. But the next proper successor to the Game Boy was the Game Boy Colour. So the Game Boy Colour was released in 1998, and I can't give you any exact sales numbers because, in fact, the sales numbers for this are rolled into the sales numbers for this. So all we know is it sold 118 million units. Can't be more precise than that, unfortunately. In terms of design, it's almost identical to the original Game Boy. The only difference is it's shorter, it's thinner, and it's not as wide. And it also had infrared added to the top. Because of its new size, it's actually a little bit more ergonomic for those with smaller hands, which is quite nice for the younger market, which they really were targeting with this. And it also came in multiple different colours. It originally came in red, blue, yellow, green, and like a cyan-y kind of colour. But as you can see, they released so many more in its lifespan. I mean, this is a transparent purple, and I think they released oranges and things like that too. So any colour you wanted, you could get with the original Game Boy. So the specs on this are very, very similar to the original Game Boy. It still has the 4 MHz processor. It just has a little bit of a RAM bump to handle the colour display. Alright. Now that display still isn't backlit. So if you're playing this in the dark, you can't see a thing. You need some kind of light source. And the most popular game for this was Pokemon Silver and Gold. The next Game Boy that Nintendo introduced was the Game Boy Advance. Now this was released in 2001 and sold roughly around about 35 million units. The interesting thing is, it was the first Game Boy to be designed not by a Japanese person, but by a Frenchman. And he had a studio in Japan or something. That led to it being landscape instead of the regular old portrait, which means that the buttons flank the display. Now for me, that's great. It's far more ergonomic and it's better to play. Some people didn't like the design, but that was a personal preference. But it still only has that mono speaker, and you still need to plug in your headphones for stereo. But apart from that, all similar buttons. You've still got a link cable port. Your port for your game's still there. It's very similar, just in a more landscape display orientation. The specs on the Advance were far more advanced than either of the Game Boys. It was the first 32-bit processor Nintendo put into their handhelds, whereas the others were 8-bit, and it ran at 16 MHz versus 4 MHz. It also had 60 kilobytes of RAM with 90 odd megabytes or kilobytes of VRAM, and it ran on 2 AA batteries that gave you 15 hours of battery life instead of 30 hours on the original Game Boys. So the next and last Game Boy we're going to talk about today is the Game Boy Advance SP. Now, Nintendo released this in 2003 to replace the Game Boy Advance. And in fact, this sold 45 million units, but this only sold 35 million units. So it sold about 10 million units more, which is impressive for something that was supposed to replace an already established console. In terms of design, it's the first Game Boy to take a clamshell approach, which is more reminiscent of the DS line, which came a little bit later in 2005. The great thing is that actually protects the display when you put it in your pocket and go outside, which is really, really good. It still has the same button layout, so A, B, D-pad, start and select, but you've also got this button just here, which we'll come on to in a minute. All the ports are the same on the top. The only major difference is the battery. It's the first rechargeable battery Nintendo put in a Game Boy, and it would give you roughly around about 10 hours of battery life. In terms of specs, it's identical to the original Game Boy Advance, so there's no difference whatsoever. The only difference really is the display. Same resolution, but it's now finally lit. 2 models came out of this, one backlit, one front lit, but they all give you exactly the same effect. You get a backlight on the screen, which means you could play it in the dark, which was the first time since the Game Boy Light back in the 90s. That means that this Game Boy is seen as the ultimate Game Boy for collectors because it can play every single Game Boy game ever released, and it's backlit. Throughout the time of the Game Boys, there were 3 major card designs that were released. You had the original Game Boy cartridge, which was just a grey square. Then you had the Game Boy Colour cartridge, which was usually transparent, and it was a little bit more curvy and had a bulge on the front to help you pull out the games. But otherwise very similar in design. And finally, you had the Game Boy Advanced cartridge. Now that was a lot shorter, so it wouldn't even fit in the original Game Boys even if you tried. Now, the Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy Advance SP were compatible with all Game Boy cartridges, all the way back to the original. Alright? The Game Boy Colour was only compatible with the Game Boy Colour and Game Boy cartridges, and the original Game Boy was only compatible with the original Game Boy cards. But every single SP and Advance can play every single game ever released for the Game Boy. So that's all we're going to go through today, guys. I know we didn't go over some of the Game Boys like the Lite and the Pocket and even the Virtual Boy, but we simply don't have them to go through. But in the next video, we're going to go through the DS line. and there will be an annotation somewhere to send you to that video when it's made live. So thank you for watching. This has been Room C10. See you next time.